Ladies and gentlemen, the goals that Europe must achieve by 2030 and up to 2050 are high, as we already said. There is no doubt about it. But Europe is late, and so is Croatia. Hélène Sibileau, Senior Policy Advisor, Buildings Performance Institute Europe, will tell us which segments are delayed, why they are delayed, and what needs to be done. Ms. Sibileau is joining us online via Zoom platform. Hello, Hélène. Zagreb calling. Do you hear us?
I hear you very well, and this is Brussels calling.
Hello, this is Eurovision. Thank you very much. Hélène, this is your time. Go.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen on your conference room. And thank you for the invitation to speak, indeed, on this maybe a bit provocative presentation title. The CE region and Croatia is lagging behind, but so is the EU on building decarbonization. It is my pleasure to represent today BPIE, the Buildings Performance Institute Europe. We are a Brussels and Berlin-based think tank that work since 2010 on anything linked to building decarbonization and energy performance. We give policy advice and we do policy analysis from design to implementation of policies. As said today, I will talk about the results of one of our study called the EU and the CEE Buildings Climate Tracker. I will give some results on indicators specifically for Croatia, as well as present the broad EU policy context and next steps. So what is actually the BPIE Buildings Climate Tracker that will help me present to you the building decarbonization progress? It is an index that is composed of a set of 5 indicators, and it is BPIE's response to the challenges of the lack of data or incomplete data sets to monitor the progress in the EU building stock. Our objective was to evaluate whether the sector is on track or not to full decarbonization by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. Our tracker is actually responding to 3 main questions. The first one is simply, what is the situation? How has decarbonization of the building stock evolved since 2015? The second question, is it enough to achieve climate neutrality in 2050? And the third question is, if it's not enough, then what degree of improvement is still needed to achieve our goals? A short presentation on what is actually monitored as indicators. Our composite index, the tracker, is composed of 5 indicators that looks at emissions, energy, but also renewables energy share, the investment in renovations, as well as the energy expenditure for households into energy. Now on to the most interesting part, the results. The main finding of our tracker, which is something which actually we publish now for 2 years consecutively, the main finding is that the EU as a whole is off track to climate neutrality. Let me explain how to read that graph. The light blue line on top shows the path to climate neutrality in the building sector to 2050. We start in 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, and we look until 2050 with an intermediate point in 2030. The dark blue line, on the contrary, shows what we're actually doing on the ground, what is the real progress. And you can see we're not doing enough, we're not in line, there is a gap. The gap in the EU as a whole is 10.3%. So we are 10 points below where we should be in 2020. The gap was widening between 2015 and 2020. It is slightly reducing in 2020, which is a good news, but there is still a gap. What is also interesting to learn from this graph, from these results, is that before we needed to have a 3.6 point progress every year to reach our goals. But because we didn't do enough yet, because there is a gap, we need to catch up. And the effort now, as of now, is 4.7 points every year. Now this is the EU. What does it look like for the CEE region? Here, in the CEE region, we also have a gap, but it's double the size of the one in the EU. It's 20.9 points. What you can see as well is, of course, because the gap is a bit bigger, the effort to catch up is also a bit bigger. So we went from 3.6 to 5.7 points of effort needed to catch up and become again on track to climate neutrality by 2050. Overall, our main results and findings are that decarbonization is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. It's the same in the EU and the CEE. They're both off track to reach the 2050 climate neutrality goal in the building sector. That means we must all act immediately, strongly and rapidly to accelerate the rates of building decarbonization. And policy from the EU level and from the national level is a crucial opportunity to actually catch up. Now I have a few slides which will explain a bit more in details some results for some of the indicators. So here I presented the overall index, but it's also interesting to see where we are actually on track or off track, where we need to make most progress. I always put in these upcoming slides the results of the EU on the left and the CEE results on the right. I think it is, I will not go into all the details, but I think it is interesting to see where there are the biggest differences and where we need the most of the effort. When we look at CO2 emissions from households, so that means residential buildings, the situation is approximately the same. We are 20% higher in terms of emissions compared to where we should be, both in the EU and in the CEE region. Looking at the service sector buildings, so non-residential, the picture is a bit better. We are not on track, but the gap is not so big. Here we can, for example, refer to the COVID pandemic and the confinement, because in 2020, probably not a lot of office buildings were occupied. So that could be an explanation for the difference between residential and non-residential buildings. When we look at the final energy consumption of residential buildings, we see a bit better picture at the EU level compared to the CEE region. And in the service sector, as I explained, we are on track, but looking only at 2020 as the reference here, we might explain that with the lack of office occupancy. As you can see, in 2021, the consumption increased again and is again above what we should be doing. Regarding the renewable energy in heating and cooling, here the picture between EU and CE is also the same, around 10 percentage points lower than the target where we should be. The renewable energy share in electricity consumption, however, is a bit different. We see that at EU level, we're almost on track where we should be, whereas we are 10 percentage points below the target value in CE region. Now, looking at investments, the picture is again more or less the same. We are around 40% lower compared to where we should be, both in EU and CE region. In the following slides, I have put some of the graphs that shows that visually give a better impression of where we are going compared to where we should be going. And I think it's quite visually interesting to see the evolution and where the gap is. I will not delve now into the details, but if the slides are shared, I think it's an interesting point to look at. I have here everything for the EU and also everything for the CE region. So don't hesitate to go into the details later on. I want to finish on this section actually recapping the indicators for both the EU and the CE region. The first message here is you see a lot of red dots, meaning we're not on track or actually far off track compared to where we should be going. And this is the same in both the EU and the CE. We have a green dot for the final energy consumption for non-residential, so service buildings. As I said, probably linked to the COVID pandemic and the non-use of offices. And the main difference in terms of achievements is the CE region being on track for CO2 emissions in non-residential buildings, and the EU doing really better in terms of renewable energy sources in electricity consumption. That's the main difference between the two regions. So these are the results for overall EU and CEE region. Now I want to give you some indicators or results looking more closely into Croatia. As a disclaimer here, I cannot do a direct comparison between EU, CEE region and Croatia because we don't have specific reference goals, reference paths to assess the performance of Croatia. However, what I can do is I can display the results for the same indicators, and that will give you an idea of the evolution or actually the non-evolution of these indicators. So in terms of CO2 emissions from both the residential and non-residential sector, you can see that between 2015 and 2021, it is quite stable. On the right side, you see the final energy consumption, and you see a good decrease between 2015 and 2019, with again an increase in 2020 and 2021. That's the top right graph, probably linked to usage patterns of buildings in the COVID years. That is also reflected in the bottom right graph on non-residential buildings, where you see a drop in 2020 and then again an increase in 2021. And now on to the two renewables share indicators. What we see for Croatia is that the share of energy, of renewable energy for heating and cooling is quite stable between 15 and 2021. It didn't really change. What has changed, though, is the share of energy from renewable sources into the electricity consumption. Here we have seen a progress, an increase between 15 and 21. This was specifically for Croatia. And into my presentation, I would like to finish by recall actually what we can do. We have seen several indicators that are not on track, with different size, different magnitude of gaps to close. And we know that to close the gap, we need to implement some measures. And usually the measures come from the policy level. And as I said, at BPIE, we're working in Brussels on EU level legislation. And here, this is also the topic of your conference. We have some news that the key legislation at EU level on buildings has been revised. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is in the process of being finally adopted. We have already the European Parliament that approved the new version. We're now waiting for member states to do the same in April, and hopefully to get the final official version published by this summer. We know then we have a transposition in member states of 2 years, so we expect this transposition and implementation phase to last around 2 years, between this year and 2026. And I think this new directive is really an opportunity to get us back on track. The transposition phase will be key to make use of all the opportunities for improvement that are included. The directive revision brought this time a lot of new provisions and a lot of updated provisions. BPIE as a think tank is also working to support both the Commission and member states and national stakeholders as well in translating this EU level legislation into national law. And we think that the dialogue and the preparations at national level with stakeholders, like the conference that is organized today, are key, and it is also key to start very early. Just a few points here on what we think as BPIE as the main provisions to look at. The updated standard for new buildings as of 2030, the minimum energy performance standards for non-residential buildings, the mandatory trajectory for the residential stock. There are several measures to have more renewables into heating and cooling. And the new EPPD also brings an improved enabling framework. So all the ecosystem around building renovation with updated renovation plans, better energy performance certificates, a scheme for renovation passports, more one-stop shops, and better financial support. So there is a lot of things to pick up from the EU level to transpose at national level to get us back on track in the coming years. Before I close, I also want to let you know that our EU Buildings Climate Tracker, the one that I presented, is the one, it's the second edition. So we started in 2022. The one I presented is from last year, and this is something that we will be doing and tracking progress every year in the next years. Our next one is foreseen to be published in October this year, and this time we will not have a geographical focus looking at a specific EU region like the CEE one, but we will focus on the topic of affordability and energy prices and looking at the social and investment parts of the building decarbonization. So if this is something you are interested in, I'm really inviting you to look at our website or get in contact with us for more questions and an exchange. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful conference today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sibileau. Does anybody have a question here from the audience? No, I have one. Hélène, you said that the biggest problem are the residential buildings, that we have the biggest gap there. So we know that we need to decarbonize residential buildings, but as someone here said, we became very addicted to EU funds, so we are all waiting for the EU to give us some additional hundreds and hundreds of million euros for decarbonization, energy renovation, and renewable energy sources. So the EU money is not coming regularly, or not as in the height that we are hoping for. How to widen that gap? How to accelerate the decarbonization, and at the same time we are waiting for the EU money that is not coming on the quality and the height that we are wanting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are several things. One is the first is to, as a country, also explain or express a willingness that you want more EU funds going to the green transition and to building decarbonization. And there are several programs and EU funds that will be again up for negotiations in the coming year. And it is also up to member states to express some sort of preferences where the EU funds can go. So that's one point. Now, in the meantime, what can be done, I think, is also an optimal use of the funds that are available, that are made available. At BPIE, what we always say and recommend is that the public money, whether it comes from the EU or the national, or even the local level, should really be used into setting up what we call the renovation ecosystem. So basically making sure that you are funding over a certain long period of time a one-stop shop to function, maybe to fund and make available for free some renovation passports, some certificates, some energy advisors to households. So basically helping them to get the information they need to get started. And then for people that have a certain quality of life, a certain income, they should really be put in touch with banks, and the private financial sector should become more involved in providing loans. So the renovation work would be partly subsidized, so public money, partly paid by banks and partly by the pockets from the households. But the fact that the public support would help to have the right information and the right roadmap on what to do would reassure the private financial sector that this is a good investment, and they would also bring the financial money. Then we know, of course, there is a certain segment of the population that cannot afford anything, and they are suffering from energy poverty. They're suffering from really complicated conditions, and of course these parts of the population should still benefit from a higher support from the public money. So I think there is really work to do to direct the public money to the right things, to bring in more private money from banks and from people who can afford it. I think this is really a fine-tuning of the use that is really helpful when we know the public money is not indefinite.
Thank you, Mrs. Sibileau. Thank you for joining us from Brussels. Još jedan pljesak molim za odgovor i prezentaciju.